This is EWS Weekly News.
Good morning, and it's great to have you with us here on this Friday morning. There was a lot of breaking news this week, and our team is standing by to cover it all. But we begin with the major breaking news earlier this week in the Derek Chauvin trial. Chauvin was found guilty on all charges by the jury. Here's EWS's Abby Cowan with the details.
As promised, we are back with an update on the Derek Chauvin trial. After 10 hours over 2 days of jury deliberation, a verdict was reached, concluding that Chauvin, former Minneapolis police officer who fatally knelt on George Floyd's neck, was found guilty this week of all 3 charges brought against him. Chauvin was convicted of second-degree unintentional murder, facing up to 40 years in prison, third-degree murder, facing up to 25 years, and second-degree manslaughter, facing up to 10 years. Minnesota state guidelines recommend 12.5 years for each murder charge and 4 years for the manslaughter charge, but in this case, the state has recommended more severe consequences. Chauvin is set to be sentenced in 8 weeks. This case is a monumental decision in the Black Lives Matter movement, as the guilty verdict is one step closer to justice. As the verdict was read, Philonise Floyd, George Floyd's brother, was seen praying, nodding, and crying and said, quote, "As an African American, we usually never get justice," end quote. Floyd's family, lawyer, and allies are now all pushing for the passage of the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, supported by President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. As Biden argues, there is still more work to be done, end quote. As for the public reaction, hundreds gathered in what is now George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, as well as outside the courthouse celebrating the guilty verdict and letting out sighs of relief. The National Fraternal Order of Police, the nation's largest police union, has also praised the trial's fairness. Many supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement and the end to systemic racism in the U.S. are celebrating this as a step in the right direction, and as the Floyd family lawyer puts it, quote, "We frame this moment for all of us, not just George Floyd," Crump said. "This is a victory for those who champion humanity over inhumanity, those who champion justice over injustice, and those who champion morals over immorality," end quote. Max.
Abby Cowan, who's been covering the trial since the beginning. Thank you, Abby. We move on to a DOJ investigation just announced by Merrick Garland into the Minneapolis Police Department. Here's EWS's Sophie Cowan.
Following the conviction of former police officer Derek Chauvin, Attorney General Merrick Garland announced Wednesday that the Department of Justice would be launching an investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department in search of patterns of discrimination and use of excessive force. Garland also said that this investigation will be a separate effort from the DOJ's previous investigation into the death of George Floyd, and that the conviction does not speak on any systematic police issues in the Minneapolis Police Department. The investigation will also examine use of excessive force during protests, which have been relentless in demanding a guilty verdict for Chauvin and justice for African Americans killed by police in the past year or so. The Trump administration only used federal resources once to investigate a police department, while the Obama administration launched dozens of investigations throughout his time as president. This investigation could take years, reviewing thousands of reports, records, and smaller investigations into training, supervision, and use of force in Minneapolis. Max?
Sophie Kalman, thank you. We continue tonight in Columbus, Ohio, with the shooting of 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant that has caused outrage. EWS's Ethan Canfield explains.
On Tuesday, April 20th, a teenage girl named Ma'Khia Bryant was killed when shot multiple times by a police officer in Columbus, Ohio. The police were called to the house of the shooting when fighting started to occur. Body cam footage shows that Ma'Khia rushed at a young woman with a knife before she was shot. The shooting occurred just moments before the verdict of the Derek Chauvin trial was read. Later that day, Ben Crump, the attorney for the Floyd family, tweeted, "As we breathed a collective sigh of relief today, a community in Columbus felt the sting of another police shooting. The shooting has sparked outrage across the country, as many feel that police brutality against black people has not been solved in the slightest. Since the shooting, many have protested for police reform and justice for Ma'Khia." Max?
All right, Ethan Canfield, thank you. We now move overseas to all of the international headlines from around the globe. For that, we turn to our international correspondent, Vicky Kai.
Thank you, Max. This week, tensions arise once again between the U.S. and Russia after last Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden announced new sanctions on Russia in response to sophisticated hackings of the company SolarWinds, along with various high-level U.S. government agencies, which Russia was identified as the culprit. In response to these sanctions, Russia announced that it had expelled 10 U.S. diplomats from the country. These moves come as Biden tries to toughen the U.S.'s stance on Russia, following the Trump administration's much softer position on this U.S. adversary. Cuba's Raul Castro stepped down from the position as first secretary of the Communist Party of Cuba on Monday, with fellow high-level communist official Miguel Díaz-Canel succeeding him in the highest office of Cuba's government. Castro's retirement brings an end to the 60-year-long Castro dynasty that controlled Cuba's Communist Party and government, beginning with his brother Fidel Castro in 1961. And Chad's president Idriss Déby died on Tuesday at age 68. His military generals report that Déby succumbed to battlefield wounds just north of N'Djamena, the capital, as he was fighting rebel forces who were allegedly attempting to overthrow his government. Déby, who was in power for more than 3 decades since 1990, and who had secured a 6th term in office just 1 day before his death, was widely criticized for his authoritarian rule, but was simultaneously seen as crucial in the fight against Islamic extremism in Central Africa. His death is poised to bring an even greater instability to a region already inflicted with multiple armed conflicts. That's our weekly international news rundown. Back to you, Max.
Vicky Kai with the international headlines. Thank you, Vicky. We continue back home with the COVID-19 pandemic and all of its updates, including the news about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Here's EWS's Jack Paransky.
Thank you, Max. COVID is still happening. That could honestly be my entire update. The new cases in the United States is trending downward due to a mass rollout of vaccines. And the Johnson & Johnson vaccine had just got its pause lifted by the CDC. So we will be seeing more vaccinations. But recently, we just hit a worldwide death toll of 3 million people. The virus is still ongoing, so please wear your masks, listen to the CDC and FDA, and be safe. Back to you, Max.
And it's important to remember that the pandemic isn't yet over. Thank you, Jack. And that's this week's edition of the EWS Weekly News from all of us. I'm Max Rothbeck. Have a great day, and I'll see you right back here next week.